Our primary mission here at Alternate Media is to bridge the gap between Judaism and Christianity, as it's existed for far too long. Yeshua, as we know, never intended to start a new religion. He was a religious Jew.
I think at a certain point in every believer's life where we think, isn't there more?
There has definitely been a need within the church. That's something that a lot of Christians are searching for. A lot of Christians know that there is something missing in their faith. And what indeed is intended to fill that is Judaic roots of the faith.
The New Testament is very clear about bridging the gap between Jew and Gentile, and we're just returning that mission back to the modern day. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Altered Podcast, or the Preparing the Way Podcast, whatever we're calling it these days. We'll eventually figure that out, but while we wait to figure that out, we've got a lot ahead of you coming in today. For our Christian friends who are celebrating, Happy Easter to you. We don't celebrate that here, but whatever, Happy Easter to you guys. For those of you who are celebrating, for the rest of us who are actually joining us here live because there's nothing better to do today, we're going to review the topic of the Trinity debate. This is part 3 of a probably 4-part series with Dr. Tuggy versus Dr. Craig. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring my fellow compatriot up here on the screen, on the correct side of the screen. How are you tonight?
I'm doing well. Been looking forward to this.
Yeah, this we're about halfway through the debate so far, and we stopped at probably the worst part in part 2.
Kind of a cliffhanger.
Yeah, now I can't wait to see the last half of this debate. Again, I've yet to see it, so this is more of a reaction video for me. Brad has already seen this, so he is more doing the review, and I'm kind of providing impromptu commentary.
Right. And so just to bring everybody up to speed, if this is the first installment of your seeing, definitely go watch the debate all the way through, right? Because we're going to be making cuts and stops and giving commentary here and there. And you can go watch the other 2 parts. But just to bring you up to speed, the entire debate up to this point has essentially been Dr. Tuggy scrutinizing the Trinitarian position, right? Mm-hmm. And so now we're going to switch roles here, and Dr. Craig is going to start scrutinizing the Unitarian position, and Dr. Tuggy will be on the defensive here. So it's the entire nature of this debate is going to change, and it's just as entertaining as the first half was. Maybe even a little bit more in my personal opinion, but it's awesome. Before that, though, who is with you in spirit, sir?
Well, as some of you have already seen, I am having a Coors banquet, but I'm continuing with the Redbreast 12.
Solid choice. It's an excellent choice. Yep. I'm because now, tomorrow is officially the 1st of April. One day closer to the eclipse that's going to end the world.
I'm going to that, by the way.
Are you really? You're going to travel for that?
I'm flying all the way to Texas to go see it. I want to go see the totality.
Oh, that's awesome. You'll have to send me pictures. But yeah, we're one day closer to the eclipse. Whatever you think about the eclipse, maybe we'll have to do like a whole show on just what that is and how honestly how Judaism would see that kind of event. Might be an interesting topic. We're also one day closer to Passover, right? Because Passover is, for those of you who are following the Jewish calendar, which we here at Alternate Media do, that is going to be the evening of April 22nd. So, trying to get rid of everything that I still have. So I'm still doing the Lone Rider. And for my beer, since I always do a Boilermaker, doing a Southern Tier Double IPA.
I'm removing you. All right, anyway, guys, we're going to do this alone.
I feel so wronged.
You have been very wronged.
All right, let's pull up the video, and this is really where the debate gets interesting to me, because I actually enjoyed hearing out Dr. Craig's scrutinizing, like his questions that he had about the Unitarian position, and in kind of the same form that he's done up to this point, he's actually been kind of very open to considering a lot of the positions, just I guess maybe he's not really encountered the answers that Tuggy has been giving before.
Props to Dr. Craig. That is a sign of somebody who is a scholar. If you're willing to say, I could be wrong for more than 20 years, I could be wrong. Unfortunately, when we run into Trinitarians, there's very little, like, it's no matter how long you talk to them, they're never going to concede the point. They're not willing to accept it. So props to him for being as intellectually honest as he's can be. He does seem to be honestly willing to concede if the point is valid.
I think what's at the core of that is that he's not really defending a creedal Trinity, whereas most everybody else is. And so the creed is what's at stake there.
That's true. They are defending more of a dogma than they are. Yeah, that's fair. That's more religious than scholarly.
Right. But without further ado, let's
go.
I mean, I don't see why it matters why we call the person substances or not.
What?
Off to a great start.
Yeah, he's already kind of
back it up like 30 seconds and
section because we're at the 32-minute mark and we've only got Dr. Craig for 1 hour.
Yeah, we're good.
So let's go ahead and turn now to your view, Dr. Tuggy. You'll get to defend it in a little bit more detail here. So first, why don't you explain what is Unitarianism?
So a Unitarian Christian theology is anyone on which the one true God is the Father alone. So the Old Testament Yahweh turns out to be one and the same as the one Jesus prayed to as our Father in heaven. Jesus for us is a man, a human person who is God's unique Son and Messiah. And we agree with all clear New Testament teachings about him, such that he died for our sins, that he was raised to immortality by God, that he was exalted to God's right hand, where he now, among other things, is the unique mediator between God and us. And in general, we want to interpret difficult and unusual New Testament passages, which are often the favorite apologist passages, by the way, Philippians 2, John 1, Colossians 1. We want to interpret the more difficult passages by the more numerous and the clearer ones. So that's what it is. It has nothing to do with Unitarian Universalism, by the way. That's why I call it a Unitarian Christian view. It's a Bible-motivated view.
Okay. Now, what are some of your reasons for holding this view? Obviously, the data from the New Testament, I know that you think that that's a reason. You can lay that out in more detail, specific verses if you want. But if there are other reasons as well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's a whole bunch of things about the New Testament, right? In John 17, 1-3, Jesus prays to the Father and calls him the only true God, right? Dr. Craig has authored a textbook for kids on logic, so he knows how you analyze a statement like that. Says that the Father is true God, and for anything, whatever, if it's true God only if it just is the Father. There's two claims that the Father is God, and that nobody else is. Those are the two claims that are being made there. It's not just that passage; it's all over the New Testament. It's usually an assumption; it's not a point of dispute in those times. So it's far more often assumed than it is stated. Lest you think that Jesus is God in the same sense that the Father is, multiple times in the New Testament, and there's nothing unclear about these passages, the Father is referred to as Jesus is God. And it's said that Jesus is under the same God that we are under, which is something that God could not do. Right? He does a bunch of things God can't do. He's tempted. God is essentially immortal, whereas Jesus dies. God can't be his own mediator, but Jesus is the mediator between God and us. There's a lot of other things about the New Testament. The pattern of worship, I think, better fits my view than Dr. Craig's. There is nowhere in the New Testament where there's presupposed worship of the Trinity. It just never happens. And there's also no worship of the Holy Spirit, which is contrary to what you would expect. What you see instead is that the primary and ultimate recipient of worship is the Father. Oh, and also Jesus, especially after his exaltation to God's right hand, is also worshipped. Revelation 4, compare that with Revelation 5. And Paul says in Philippians 2 that Jesus is worshipped to the glory of God the Father, right? God is not worshipped to the glory of somebody above him. Just the way it uses the terms God that we hear. We have the term God the Father in the New Testament. We don't have the term God the Trinity. We don't have the term God the Son. We don't have the term God the Spirit. Just think about the fact that there is no term at all that it was then understood to refer to the Trinity. that's a dead giveaway. They didn't believe in the Trinity, right? The very first thing they would do is they would come up with a word by which to refer to this tripersonal God that they believe in, not only its parts, right? So I'm not just making a point here about the word Trinity. Later on in the 4th century, towards the end, sometimes they use the word God to mean the Trinity, right? That would be good enough. You just coin a new usage of the word God. That doesn't happen in the New Testament. There is no New Testament word, phrase, title, name that was then understood to refer to a triune God, and that's because it's from a later age. I already mentioned the kind of unqualified, unembarrassed implications of limits on the Son, the just endorsement of core Jewish theology and no claim that, it's horribly deficient. It has a God that's not really perfect or anything like that. And yeah, I mean, that's good enough for me. I also already mentioned that you don't see a tripersonal God doctrine in early Christianity until roughly after the year 350. By the time of Augustine, it's everywhere. In 350, it's nowhere. You have Logos theorists, and then you have the more modalist sympathizers like Marcellus of Ancyra. And that's what you had going back to the late 100s. And by the way, there were some people with views like mine running around back then. They were historians called them dynamic monarchians. But the dynamic monarchians and the Logos theorists, they're both Unitarians in the sense that they believe that the one God just is the Father alone and not anybody else. Now, they have lesser divine being as the Logos and a yet lesser divine being as the Spirit. But yeah, they're still Unitarians. I mean, the most famous American Unitarian, the pastor named Channing, he held the pre-existence. And I think he held to the personality of the Spirit too, but I'm less sure about that. So look, it's a later view. It's a view that you only really see in the 4th century. It clashes with the New Testament. How? The New Testament identifies the one God with the Father. Any such Trinity theory identifies the one God with the Trinity, and those can't both be true because the Father is not the Trinity. And just to say one more consideration, God is competent. When God reveals something, such as that God raised Jesus from the dead on that one Sunday, when he reveals it, people actually believe it. Okay? So if he revealed that God is triune in the 1st century, you would have people in the 1st, 2nd, and early 3rd century believing it. But you don't have those people. I've spent about 2 decades now reading all the extant sources, and it's just not what you would want to be there as a Trinitarian. In fact, the Nicene view, developed as the controversy went on. You don't have a triune God in 325 when they're just arguing about the status of the Logos. You do, I think, have a triune God presupposed in the very similar statement from 381, although you have to read between the lines because they were very gun-shy about introducing new language. Right, but right after 381, everybody's running around talking about a triune God. People like Augustine, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, but not before that. And that's because that was new, right? And we know that God didn't reveal it because Christians are just on their own to make their best of this language. You had imperial enforced language. And here in 2022, we're still trying to figure out, how best to understand this claim that the one God is 3, quote, persons or hypostases in one ousia, substance or essence, right? Dr. Craig has a view about that. It's fairly creative and, in a sense, well thought through, but it's contrary to, equally developed views by Mike Ray or Peter Van Inwagen or Brian Leftow, right? We're all just on our own trying to figure this out. God didn't reveal it, is why. It's a later small c Catholic theory, and Protestants are better off without it because the New Testament makes better sense on its own.
Okay, we've got about 20 minutes left.
Right.
Okay. Solid stuff there.
You kind of see how he came around to making a lot of the same points that you were making early on.
Yeah, it's really funny. I swear I've never seen this. But you can actually tell that I've never seen this because the way Dr. Tuggy words the same arguments that I was making, totally different way of how he brings forth those arguments. Generally, though, he brought up some of the stuff that I would have personally. Some things that I said before, like the language doesn't have to be there. They could have developed it early. They didn't.
Right.
Christians today have no problem saying phrases like Jesus is God. And you don't need to have a sophisticated developed language to say that. You can just say that and then come up with the sophisticated, homoousis substance stuff. You can come up with that later, but still be comfortable with saying Jesus is God. But they were obviously not. They avoided that phrase. And so there's a reason for that. Everything else, God is not a God of confusion. Another great point. Jesus' God is God, right? Jesus has a God, clearly. Another great point. Something I didn't even think to bring up.
One of the things that struck me about what he said, and just kind of clicked for me. He didn't put it in quite so many words, and I think he goes into a bit more detail on it later. But essentially, one of the only ways, given what he has noted, right, that there was no word, right, there was no sense of identifying the Trinity, because like the biblical language of the New Testament doesn't actually shift from what we read in the Old Testament, right? If anything, it actually shifts much more so in the direction of what we observe in Orthodox Judaism today, where we see more circumlocutions instead of using the actual divine name, you know. So it actually shifts more in line with what we observe today in Orthodoxy than what we observe today in Christianity. But the only way really around that is a sort of like assumed Trinitarianism, right? In other words, that it was just, no, they didn't have a word for it, but it was understood between them that when they referred to God, they were referring to a Trinity. The trouble with that is, especially in their writings, it would necessitate an explicit explanation defining what they were talking about, because they weren't just all writing letters to each other. They were writing letters to people who would have had no other concept of this, right? They were writing to other people that, especially any of the letters addressing Jews,
right?
They're writing to people that only have a concept of a Unitarian God. Right now, I know that's there's some debate around that with Michael Heiser and whatnot, and that's something else I want to address in a minute. But yeah, you would have to argue this assumed Trinitarianism, which necessitates progressive revelation. I have my own problems with progressive revelation because I just don't find a basis for it in Scripture. So the only other argument really is this idea from Heiser that like we just superimpose a multiplicity of Godhead onto Old Testament passages and some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then we say, yeah, we don't really see this shift towards Unitarianism until later rabbinic writings. And it's like, well, no, it's not really a shift, because the writings you're referencing are not inherently pluralistic in their defining of God. Not only that, they're not even really Jewish if we're going to be strict about our terminology. They're not really Jewish. Yes, they were written by Jewish people. That does not make them Jewish any more than my favorite example is the Grimoire of Pope Honorius is a Christian writing, right? Just because it was authored by somebody who was professing to be a Christian doesn't make it a Christian text. So we don't see a shift in Jewish writing. What we see is Jews actually start to write what they have believed. That's what happens with rabbinic writing, right? Yeah. There's no point in rabbinic writing where there's a shift. It's just rabbinic writing actually starts to happen.
That, and even by the most liberal of scholars, you will hear that the true shift to monotheistic thinking happens during Ezekiel's time. And that's by liberal scholarship. That's them saying Judaism was never a monotheism until Ezekiel. Like, that is a very liberal view. But even then you have to explain the shift from thousands of years of monotheistic belief since a little before Ezekiel, in fact, and then suddenly going back to the ancient Israelite style of monology, the belief in many gods but only one correct God style of religion kind of thing. Again, you have to jump through hoops. And my favorite argument by Dr. Tuggy so far, he brought it up early. He said the few difficult passages are interpreted by the majority of the clear and simple passages. That's so far my favorite argument. I wrote that down and highlighted it, and I was like, that's amazing, because he brings up a good point. It's only the difficult passages that the apologists for the Trinity rely on, and they have to sort of ignore all of the plethora of the majority of the simple passages that very clearly spell things out. And so he's like, we take the difficult stuff, we acknowledge that they are difficult, but we interpret them using the plethora of the simple stuff that is plain, easy language that states plainly there is one God and Jesus is a human, and then we go from there, and instead of the other way around where we take the difficult passages and then reshape the many plethora of the easy passages to fit that narrative. It's a great argument.
And to clarify what I said earlier about what we can rightly consider Jewish writing versus a text that was written by Jews. Is for any of the Trinitarian Christians who are watching, hot take, there was only one Judaism at the time. Okay. Everything else was a heresy. And why do I have the right to say that? Because that's exactly what Christians say about early Christian history. There was only one Christianity at the time, and everything else was a heresy. So unless you're going to consider the writings of the Ebionites, of the early Nazarenes, of some of the early Gnostics, unless you're going to accept those under the moniker of Christian texts, then you cannot throw any of the pseudepigraphal texts under the title Jewish text, right? It's theologically outside of the spectrum of what is Judaism and what has essentially always been considered Judaism, even by Jesus himself, right? There's only one sect of Judaism that he affirmed as being the correct path. And all of the others, he essentially said, you're just flat wrong, or he never encountered, because, if you want to say that some of the early texts that Tuggy might actually himself appeal to, written by early Christians, that you would consider heretical, if you're willing to call those Christian texts, then I'll concede the point. But usually Christians are not willing to concede that point.
Yeah. Typically, it's a very. I mean, that's kind of how you have to defend the Trinity. You have to exclude. This is where, by the way, for those of you who are not historians, this is where the term orthodoxy starts to come from, because early Christians started doing this. They were like, well, they're not really Christians. Orthodox means correct. It basically means the correct way. And so orthodox, correct, and heterodox, incorrect, is where we get the term heresy. So even early Christians started doing that. We were like, well, no. They're heterodox. We're orthodox. We've got it right. They're not us. We're not with them. They started doing that very early on. And that's why we as historians try not to use the term orthodox when referring to Christianity at large, because it actually turns out that what would become orthodox was, in fact, the minority position for so long. But they happened to have the power of Rome behind them eventually, and it became orthodoxy. And it's just misleading to refer to them as orthodox when they were not the majority until much later. But yeah, long story short, that's where this comes from. It's a very old tactic.
Right.
All right, push.
Yeah, we'll push.
All right.
I know of at least two reasons you gave there, so I'm going to mention these one at a time, and if I leave one out, Dr. Tuggy just will throw it in. So the first reason I think you were getting at was there's no name for this Trinitarian God in the New Testament. We have, did you want to say something, Dr. Craig?
Yes, I don't think that that's the key point. If I may take the bull by the horns here.
Yeah, go for it.
Jordan. The linchpin of the Unitarian argument is that the statements in the New Testament that the Father is God are to be construed as identity statements. And so Dale will say again and again that the New Testament identifies the Father as God. Now, I think there's two things wrong with that statement. First of all, the ancients in general and the New Testament authors in particular did not have a grasp of the modern relation of identity. This is something that evolved centuries later. And so when interpreters impose upon these New Testament statements a modern grasp of the relation of identity, they are anachronistic in their hermeneutics and are imposing meanings upon these writers that they did not themselves assert. Secondly, the same authors also assert not simply that the Father is God, but that Jesus Christ is God. They make the same sort of statements about Christ. And therefore, these cannot be identity statements that the Father is God. These are predications of divinity of the Father and likewise of the Son. So when you look, for example, in the New Testament at the Johannine writings, it's not just apologists, it is virtually every Johannine scholar and commentator who thinks that, according to John, Jesus Christ was God. John 1:1 opens the gospel by saying, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten from the Father. No man has ever seen God, the only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father. He has made him known." So twice in the prologue, John refers to Jesus Christ as God. And then in the climactic chapter of the Gospel of John 20 and verse 28, you have the appearance to Thomas and the 12, where Thomas makes this ringing confession to Jesus, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus blesses Thomas for his confession of faith. These are the Christological bookends of the Gospel of John. And every New Testament commentator that I know of thinks that in John's view, Jesus Christ was unequivocally and fully God. And then in 1 John 5:20, John says, "We are in him who is true and in his Son, Jesus Christ. He is the true God and eternal life." So just as John says in 17:3 that the Father is the true God, so he says in 1 John 5:20 that Jesus Christ is the true God. These are not identity statements. These are predications of full divinity to the Father and to the Son. And elsewhere in the New Testament, we find other New Testament authors making similar affirmations. For example, Titus 2:13.
Maybe we should pause there. That's you just put out a whole bunch of points that I want to address, if that's okay. I apologize for.
All right.
He did put out a lot of points.
He did.
I wrote most of them down. I did my best to capture the ones.
So I've got three main contentions with kind of what he said. Let's see. His initial argument, right, which is an attempt to disqualify Tuggy's argument. And this is, I've talked about this before. He's essentially submitting a snuck premise, right? He's arguing that the Jews of the New Testament, namely the authors, had no concept for identity, right? They didn't have an understanding. They didn't have the same understanding that we have of identity, and therefore wouldn't be able to to voice, right, and vocalize that essentially the identifying statements where they identify the Father as God are not actually them identifying the Father as God, because they couldn't have meant that, because they didn't even have a concept for it. They couldn't conceive of it, so that's not what they meant. The problem is, you cannot therefore inject the Trinity into that, because if they didn't have the concept of identity, then they wouldn't have conceived of three identities either. Right? It doesn't work. You can't have both. If that's your argument for one, you've immediately disqualified the other. But be that as it may, it seems as though, and I'm not going to say emphatically that he hasn't, but based on that argument, it seems that Craig is not very familiar with early rabbinic writings, right? He's clearly never read things like the Talmud, because if he had, then the conclusion that you immediately come to are that actually, yes, early rabbinic Jews had a probably a better comprehension and working understanding of identity than the lay human being in the modern West today.
So my immediate, I actually wrote this down too. They did not understand identity. John's gospel alone seems to, just the way it's written, refute that idea. People might be familiar with the famous 7 I am statements from Jesus, where Jesus says, I am 7 times, and he says, I am in different ways. I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection. I am, he says these different I am style statements. Of course, Christians hone in on the I am itself because they're pulling from Exodus 3 wrongly. But the point being is that they are imposing a particular style of identity onto Jesus in this passage. It's actually very sophisticated writing. The book of John is incredibly sophisticated and mystical style Greek. To agree with you there, I think to say that they don't understand identity would be to undercut John in its entirety. As well as, and then to move from that, my next point was, you notice he only quotes John, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
To put it this way, because this is not the only topic that I have found this to be the case on. It was an incredibly humbling experience, actually, to read through Tanya the first time, for numerous reasons. And this is Tanya going back, and it doesn't go back that far, but the ideas and teachings and concepts go back arguably as far as even John's writing, because we see them present and they're obvious in John's writing. There are multiple modern concepts that we think that we've discovered today, right? It's this awesome new discovery that humanity has advanced so far to making, that honestly, ancient Jews have always had a grasp of, but nobody ever asks them. So it's kind of just been stuck in the community forever. Mathematical concepts, right? The idea that there's 10 dimensions. This is something math has only recently confirmed. And esoteric Jews are sitting here like, yeah, dude, like we've always known that, right?
Even like, just forget about Judaism for a little bit, right? Let's actually go a little bit outside. Like, obviously, Judaism is highly educated, literate. They're kind of the exception to the rule when it comes to all cultures and religious practices. But just take a look at the Stoics. The Stoics were incredibly self-aware Greeks. I don't know if you finished reading Marcus Aurelius yet, but the Marcus Aurelius book, his book Meditations, is incredibly self-aware. It's very, like, he understands identity, and he understands so much about himself and humanity as a whole. In Meditations, great book, by the way. If you haven't read it, you should read it.
Yes.
Obviously it's Greek, so it is not Hebrew philosophy, but it's great. It's still great. Stoicism, regardless, it's just good.
It's honestly, it's something that every man should read if he endeavors to be a masculine man, regardless of what your definition of masculinity is. It's something that every man should read.
Yes, I agree. But yeah, so this concept, like, I feel like everyone does this too. They always attribute stupidity and ignorance to the ancient people because, well, we today, we have a better understanding. Back then they didn't have calculators. We everyone's literate now, and it's no.
We think entirely too highly of ourselves in the modern culture. It's ridiculous.
The fact is, we are dumber than our ancient counterparts. Our ancient counterpart, 6,000 years ago, no, they didn't know the earth was round. They thought it was flat. That's trivial at best. Who cares? They built the pyramids and we still don't know how. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like there's so much lost that we have lost. We are not smarter. Evolution doesn't happen. Entropy happens. And we have been slowly devolving over time, not evolving.
Another example of this, actually, that kind of jumped out at me this week scrolling through TikTok, because being a homeschooler, right, I follow several other homeschooler accounts, and this one particular account was in a dispute over the one room classroom, right, the one schoolhouse classroom that used to be the case here in the 1830s, and somebody was basically saying, well, it was a nightmare. So if that's what you want to do and you want to step back into the 1830s, and then you do you. And the homeschool mom was like, I don't think you understand. I know that you meant to insult me, but I don't think you understand that that's actually not an insult when you consider the literacy rates of the modern high school graduate. Now, naturally, the person threw back the literacy rates from back then because it was extraordinarily low. Now, the problem with that, and of course, homeschool mom had to break this down, is that statistic that you're giving me is including the total population, like including people who didn't go to school because they weren't allowed, right? Cool. The law was funny back then, but there was a large portion of the population that wasn't allowed to go to school. So the literacy rate is not necessarily the product of the school system back then. Because if you actually look at the literacy rate of people who went to school back then, it's 98%.
Yeah.
So by comparison,
per capita, it's people are graduating high school with a 6th grade level reading level.
Right.
And that is sad. Meanwhile, in the 1830s, Abraham Lincoln was plowing a field while reading some of the most sophisticated Koine Greek. Not Thomas. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson. He was fluent in Koine Greek, and he would often read the Stoics in its original language with his daughters reading them alongside him in its original Koine Greek. A lot
of the founding fathers, we would consider them biblical scholars today.
Thomas Jefferson was more familiar with Talmud than just about any of the internet trolls today who tell us that we don't understand Talmud at all. The guy could actually read it, and he was way more familiar with it than most people are.
Yep. John Adams, Thomas Paine. There's a few of them. Some of them non-Trinitarians because of their working understanding of these languages and being able to read the text in their original languages. His other point about Johannine scholars, okay, and then he makes another appeal to every New Testament scholar. This is not only an acknowledgement of confirmation bias, right? Because basically the only Johannine scholars are Trinitarians. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. They are not Trinitarians because they became Johannine scholars. They became Johannine scholars because they were Trinitarians. In other words, they believed the Trinity and they set out to prove the Trinity correct, so they became Johannine scholars. That's immediately confirmation bias. If I set out to prove myself correct and then I do so, then am I really a professional? Or if I've never come under scrutiny from another, and that's the other aspect to this, which is basically it's a no true Scotsman, is that there are scholars who are non-Trinitarians who have studied and pored over the Johannine writings every bit as much as what we would consider a Johannine scholar. But we don't call them Johannine scholars, and we don't call them New Testament scholars because, well, they're not Trinitarian, so they can't be, right? That's the no true Scotsman, right? Because every New Testament scholar is a Trinitarian. It's a circular argument, also.
It is very weird, but I've said this in the past 100 times. People often ask and wonder why I don't call myself a theologian or I don't really appeal to theologians, because that is what theology is. You can be a doctorate in 500 different theological studies, and they can't all be correct. They all contradict each other. They all have different dogmas that they hold to. But that's theology. Theology is you pick a belief and then you seek out to prove it correctly. That's theology. History is the other way. You take a look at what the data says and you come to conclusions based on what you have in front of you. That's history. And then, you can take some creative liberties because there are pieces that are missing. So you have to use essentially your best scientific guess. And good historian will tell you when they're doing that. But yeah, theologians, I almost never appeal to theologians. I don't like debating with theologians because they are that. They are not historians. They are not looking at the data and coming to a conclusion with just the data. They are, in fact, working with a dogma and then seeking out the proof texts for that dogma. It's the other way of study. And so, yeah, I chose history, not theology.
A good example of this actually is regarding and look, have whatever opinion you want to have on the subject. Or we're not here to discuss that, but this is the reality of the situation of this discussion in Christianity at large. This is the way that organizations like Answers in Genesis and basically any and every other young earth creationist organization is treated this exact same way. Now, AIG used to, all right, it's been years since I've been on their website, but AIG used to have an actual list of every scientist who works for them, right? And what degree they have and what subject it's in, right? So you can look these people up and see their credentials. It was an entire list of it. Okay. You could submit that list to somebody who believes in an old earth and accepts evolution, right? Immediately, the no true Scotsman fallacy. Well, those aren't real scientists. Well, why aren't they real scientists? Well, because they believe in young earth creationism. Okay, so that's circular then. You asked me to find a scientist who believes in young earth creationism. I found you an entire list of them, and then you said because they believe in that, they are not scientists.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with Trinitarian New Testament scholarship. It's treated identically.
Often, I've yet to really run into that kind of thing because I've had my fair share of quoting non-Trinitarian scholars, New Testament historians and scholars alike. And I've yet to have them, in my personal anecdotal experience, they've not been dismissed on the grounds that they're not Trinitarian. They've been treated hostilely, for sure. They're sort of like, well, he's got a bias to prove, and so he's not Trinitarian because he's not a believer to begin with. And they don't really dismiss the scholarship, but they sort of dismiss they're saying that he's the biased one. And, again, then it's sort of a my scholars versus your scholars type situation.
And that's what the argument of scholarship ultimately resorts into. If it's two people who are familiar with the scholarship arguing, it ultimately does boil down to, well, my scholars are more valid than your scholars.
Yeah, and that's a faulty appeal to authority. And a couple other things before we move on. Dr. Craig brought up a couple of things. So according to John, he says, again, he's quoting only from John or Johannine letters and works. This, and I wrote this down in my notes, this should really make a person pause, right? If all of your Trinitarian proofs are coming from a single source, and then there are 33 other authors of the Bible who say otherwise, but you're going to go with the one, you need to take a step back and reconsider the weight that you give to the one author, the Johannine authors, which is not even really one author. It's probably several. But the point being, only from John are you going to get these Trinitarian style doctrines. And that should by itself make you stop and think, is this valid? Because I'm only getting that vibe, so to speak, from this one source, and that's it. And then he quoted only begotten God. That's a mistranslation, and it's also only found in the newer Alexandrian texts, which are post the Nicene Creed. Dr. Tuggy has already brought up that the Nicene Creeds themselves, the first one wasn't technically Trinitarian. It left out the Holy Spirit. The second one in 381 would squeeze the Holy Spirit in there, and still it wasn't quite yet a Trinity. But And then the "My Lord and my God" statement from Thomas. I think we've done a video on that one. That one's low hanging fruit.
Basically.
But do you want to keep pushing?
Yeah, we can push for a little bit more.
Where are we? 45. Oh, actually, is that probably a good stopping point for part 4?
That might be a good stopping point. I mean, yeah. So we're 3/4 of the way through. So, yeah, just enough time to leave for part 4 next week.
Yeah. Okay. That actually gives us more time to go over our notes here.
Indeed. One thing, going back to the earlier bit that Tuggy brought up, is that God is a competent God.
Yeah, I wrote that down too.
I love that point because it's true. I mean, if you go through all of the other prophecies, all of the other, theological revelations, right, then this really stands out as the only one that there's like any room for doubt. And like, let's be clear, there is room for doubt. Okay. I don't think any respectable, honest Trinitarian would not at least concede there is room for doubt.
There has to be. It's every real like Trinitarian scholar. I use that term loosely, but many are willing to admit that it's incomprehensible. So there's a certain point at which you just accept it, and it goes against your logical capabilities.
Right. And so this example, the point to that is this example stands out as almost a bit of a special plea, right? It's the one point of self-revelation that God was apparently too incompetent to reveal in such plain, inarguable terms that it could be acknowledged and understood as an emphatic fact.
That's a great point. I wrote that down too. Basically, I reduced it down to God is not a God of confusion. So I think once you introduce a triune God, you immediately tell that to anyone on the street who is not steeped in Christian dogma doctrine. Confusion right away. Okay, wait, do I serve one God, or is it three, or is it a 3-1? Is it partialism? They're not going to use that kind of language, but it is a confusing thing to bring up. It's not even worth bringing up. At a certain point, at what point do you really just go, okay, scholars are allowed to be Trinitarian, but we just don't tell the layperson. We just leave it out, all right? One God, one mediator, Jesus, the Messiah, one and done, that's it. And all the super high, lofty, ethereal stuff, we'll save that for the colleges when the guys go to get their doctorate dissertation. Then we will let them in on that very confusing stuff. But to ask any layperson to comprehend even a little bit, or to even accept the Trinity as a means of, salvation or being led into the Christian circle, it's too much. Almost nobody is really Trinitarian. Almost nobody. In fact, that survey, I think we've covered it a few years ago. Like 80% of the people were saying, "Yeah, I'm Trinitarian," and then that same 80%. They were asked a follow-up question. That question was, do you think that Jesus is God's greatest creation? And like 75% of those 80% said yes, which is not Trinitarianism. So even Trinitarians don't understand the Trinity, a vast majority of them.
Right.
Yeah. And then the last point that I had written from Craig's side, however, and then I want to go to the dynamic monarchian. I want to talk about that just a little bit, but Craig said they use the same language for God and Jesus. They do not.
Right. No, that is demonstrably false.
Yeah, that is. They're actually the New Testament writers are very careful to make very clear distinctions. Even though you could muddy the waters a bit and say, well, it's pretty similar to the way they talk to God. You could say that. And there's some validity to some of those statements, but only particularly with the Gospel of John. In every other New Testament writing, there's a very, very clear line of distinction between God and Jesus, and the language is not at all similar.
Right. It's also, interestingly enough, it's also an argument that can't actually be made in any way sustainable without comparing it to the Septuagint,
Yeah.
which that's already kind of, shoddy enough. But when you then go and compare those Septuagint passages to the Masoretic text, what it actually seems like is that Greek is actually just too limited to convey the distinction that the Hebrew text lays out very clearly. And so we see this redundancy in the Greek text that we then also see in the New Testament text that is not quite as specific as what we get out of the Hebrew text.
Yeah, and part of the unspecifiability, I think Greek language is a more, it's more of a thinker's language, so it does use concepts that cross over more vaguely so that they can be used in more than one context. So
Right.
it is a bit more of a vague language in that way. But also the translators of the actual Septuagint, the Torah, were pretty careful not to, use certain language. Like they use circumlocutions a lot.
Right.
So they constantly avoided, using some sort of Greek equivalent to Hashem, right? Hashem wasn't being used at the time of the Septuagint. And so it was either we vocalize in Greek what the name would sound like, or we just put the general word for Lord and call it a day. And then now that's kind of problematic in that everywhere you see kurios being used, which is just a very, very general word for Lord,
Yes.
happens to be included there. And so you create this sense of confusion when you move that into the New Testament and then try to cross them over. And yeah.
That I point that out actually in my review of the debate with James White, Michael Brown, Anthony Buzzard, and Joseph Good, because James White makes the statement that there's nowhere in Scripture where kurios is used in the context that Joseph Good and Anthony Buzzard are arguing that it's being used in the New Testament, which is essentially the argument that it's more an equivalent to like Elohim, where it can be one or it can be the other based on the context.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that in the Septuagint, in Psalm 110:1, it's used twice, where in the Hebrew text, there's two very different words. The Hebrew text essentially says, Hashem says to my Adoni, and in the Septuagint, it's Kurios says to Kurios.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's two different contexts to the word there. So obviously, James White is wrong about the fact that it never shows up in Scripture in that context.
And then that's one of my favorite points, because obviously that is a limitation of the Greek language in that particular instance. But if you know the Hebrew, then it's not a problem. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, dynamic monarchianism.
Oh boy.
How familiar are you with such a term? Dynamic.
I'm actually not that familiar with that one, so you're gonna have to educate me on that.
Okay, so full disclosure, I've heard it before, but it's not something I've spent a lot of time studying. And so instead of trying to break it down, I've decided to look up Encyclopedia Britannica and a few other definitions, but I'm going to go with this one. I think this one fits it the best from what I was looking at, especially the history that it gives of dynamic monarchianism. Dynamic monarchianism held that Christ is a mere man, miraculously conceived, but constituted the Son of God simply by the infinitely high degree in which he had been filled with the divine wisdom and power. This view was taught at Rome about the end of the 2nd century by Theodotus, which Dr. Tuggy brought up Theodotus, who was excommunicated by Pope Victor and taught somewhat later by Artemon, who was excommunicated by Pope Zephyrinus about 260 AD, and it was again taught by Paul of Samosata. So dynamic. That's what Dr. Tuggy is. It's follows the adoptionist sort of
Right.
Viewpoint, and so we would more simply refer to it as adoptionism, but definitionally it is different. Adoptionism is
You brought up something there that's worth touching on. Because what it is we see the effects of it today, and because nobody is aware that it happened, nobody knows that their reaction is actually the effect of what you mentioned. Right. So you mentioned two people who taught this that were excommunicated. And then if we look throughout history, we'll see there were many more who were excommunicated and even persecuted and executed in some cases for denial of these creeds, right? Denial of the Trinity. The reason, so I'll tell a story real quick. I was having a discussion with a friend once, a friend who is they were the kind of Christian that, like, they don't really go to church on a regular basis, but they have an understanding of God. They grew up going to church, and they have their own relationship with God, but they're not exactly somebody I would consider to be theologically literate. Definitely not somebody who knows more about the Bible than like the basic Sunday school stories that children learn. And that's not to come down hard on them. That's just generally like the kind of person they were. So I would say the average 21st century Western Christian, right? The average American Christian, because let's not be dishonest with ourselves. The majority of people out there would self-identify as Christian, and the majority of people out there are not regular church attending people. So they fit into this category. And we were talking kind of along these lines, and I forget why it got brought up, but it got brought up, and I mentioned to them, I said, look, there's a certain reaction that I could elicit from you by making a statement, and you would react a certain way, and you wouldn't know why you reacted that way. And you in this conversation, not to brag, that I know more about this topic than you, but you would still react that way, right? And they didn't believe me, so they said, okay, go ahead. And I said, suppose that I suggested to you that Jesus isn't God, right? And their eyes almost popped out of their head. And I said, see, that's the reaction. Right? Now, you know that of the two of us, I have studied theology infinitely more than you. Okay? So you know that if we actually had an argument about this, you would never be able to defend your position. But you had that reaction. That reaction is not because it's so thoroughly broadly accepted, because it's an inherently obvious doctrine. That reaction is because of the persecution that came from not believing it. Okay? People were scared to not affirm it. So they didn't worry about whether or not they understood it. They just affirmed it to avoid persecution, because what happened is that people who did challenge it got persecuted. That's why we have that reaction today.
Yeah, to that point, even us, we're sort of a little guilty of that. When we first started this ministry, we were like, hey, let's avoid the topic of the Trinity because it's just not worth the backlash. And right. So we were like, yeah, we'll just, there's no reason to lie if somebody asks about it, but we will avoid kind of making it a topic of discussion more broadly. Then it was like, it didn't take long.
To my point, it didn't take long to have to address it.
Yeah,
right?
It didn't take long.
It was less than a year, less than even 6 months that we had been active online that we had to address it, because that's the number one question anybody asks. Okay. If as soon as you start saying anything that maybe they've never heard of before, or they've never explored quite so deeply, as soon as you start expounding on the scriptural text and concluding things that they're not familiar with, they immediately go to the Catholic litmus test. Mm-hmm. Are you a Trinitarian? Right? Because in their mind, if you're not a Trinitarian, then I get to disqualify everything that you just said on that basis, aka excommunicate you.
Yeah.
Right? And it doesn't matter whether or not what you've said is consistent with the scriptural text. You're not a Trinitarian, so it's automatically wrong.
Yeah, and I've brought this up I think we've done a video on this anyway. But when it comes to like the council at Nicaea, there were no non-Trinitarians that were invited. It was between Arianism and what would eventually become the Orthodox Trinitarian doctrine. I want to be very clear, though. Arian thought Jesus was God. Okay, he just had a different way of thinking of the divinity of Jesus. And so this was not a debate between Jesus is a human and Jesus is divine. That is not the Nicene Council. There are no Unitarians invited to the Nicene Council, so they never got a fair shake. But even then, it was funny is after both Nicene Councils, Eusebius writes that the majority of the world still was Arian because it made more sense to them. So, yeah.
Yep. And that bears out in the chronology of the Arian controversy. Matter of fact, you can even Google that, and the first or second website that should pop up is literally just a list of dates and events that were involved in the Arian controversy, and you just go down the list, and you can fact check all of them. It is a legitimate, concise list of events and councils that were held during the time period of the Arian controversy, and it is borne out that Arianism temporarily won out, and it didn't begin to decline until much, much later.
Yeah. So that's about an hour. That brings us, I think, to the end of our show, more or
Indeed.
less. So we'll have to see you guys. Next week is April 7th. I will be out of town next week, so we won't be doing a show next week.
Okay. All right.
I'm going to Texas.
That's right, because you're going to see the eclipse. It's something interesting just to touch on that very quickly, because naturally this time of year and Passover, right? There's always the dispute over the calendar. We probably could have done an episode about the calendar tonight and touched it a little bit more closely, but the dispute about the calendar always comes up, and that's because there are those who follow alternative calendars to the calendar established by the Sanhedrin, and they feel justified because they've derived it from combining very vague texts about the sun, moon, and stars with some of the writings of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, namely the Pseudepigrapha. And so it's interesting. Their calendar, they intentionally try and place Passover after the spring equinox, right? Any year that Passover might fall before the spring equinox, they add an extra month so that it falls after the spring equinox. There are some that don't even believe in adding a month in general. And so it lands whenever it lands. But somebody brought up an interesting point, is that this eclipse actually seems to be a more legitimate reset, right, than the spring equinox itself. Because you've got the sun and moon in perfect alignment with one another on the first day of the Hebrew month, which happens to directly coincide with the Hillel 2 calendar. It's like an exact reset, a precise reset.
Very interesting. All right, cool. Well, we got some haters in the comments, but whatever. That's normal. You're not doing anything new.
Get in line.
Yeah, get in line. You think you're the first to come at it?
Matter of fact, if you're willing to debate the topic, then I'm sure there's somebody else in the comments who would be willing to debate with you. Get with us after the show.
Random Chris is already on it.
Oh boy.
So anyway, I think that'll do it for today. We doing the after parties?
Oh yeah, I'm gonna sit in the after parties for a little bit.
Cool. Links are in the description down below. If you are a member, membership starts at just $1, either on our website, alternatemedia.com, ALTARNATE, media.com, altar like altar of the Lord. You can join our Patreon, patreon.com/alternatemedia, spelled the same. Membership starts at $1. You get exclusive access to tons of content, mostly early access to stuff on our website and the Patreon. And then
a few special events that we hold.
And special events. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. And then the after part is, which post show, we're about to leave here now into the Discord, where if you're a member, you get to hang out with us, chill, ask us questions, joke, whatever you guys want to do for the next, usually we're in there for about an hour. Excuse me. And
we also have released our first book. I was reminded of that today. So my parents got theirs.
Nice.
And that's not what reminded me today, but something else reminded me today, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm an author now.
Buy the book. Link in the description below.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that being said, no show next week. We will be headed to the after parties. Hit the like and subscribe button, ring that bell if you want to be alerted when we have more content up. We will be continuing this. We got one more part, I guess, if we can manage to make it through an entire quarter. We've been pretty consistent, so I think it'll be all right.
I think we'll be fine.
And more content like this coming your way. We're going to be doing a lot more. I think a lot more reviews this year. I think we'll be doing, and definitely more great articles. There's a few different topics that we're working on right now that are all spectacular. I'm super excited about all of them. A couple of other book ideas floating around, so they may not be out this year, but there's a few other book ideas floating around.
Yeah, there's a lot.
That being said,
all thanks to our supporters, by the way.
Yes, you guys are awesome. We had our Purim giveaway Monday night. That was awesome as usual. It's always a good time. Some really good questions got asked. Some that we didn't have like a solid answer for. There's not really a right or wrong answer to some of them. Some of them are just a topic that I'd never really considered before. So it's something that I'm looking into. Cool stuff.
And a lot of those books have already been sent out, and some of them have already made it to the doorsteps of many of you guys, of the winners. So yeah,
indeed. So if you want to be part of more of that, you can definitely become a paying member. Come hang out with us in the after parties. Get your name in for next year's Purim book giveaway. And then we do a monthly book giveaway. We have a monthly book club that we do. A bunch of other things. We always try and give back to the community because the community that we have has been so charitable and generous. You guys really are awesome, and we love you guys immensely. So that being said, hope tonight has been enlightening and informative, or at least made you think just a little bit. And we look forward to the next time that we see you. L'chaim.